We have 2 or 3 nominations. Charnel B.L. Kindgren, nominated to the Eastern District of Washington. Does anyone seek recognition to speak on her nomination? Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad to welcome our colleague, Senator Feinstein, back to this committee. But I will say what's going to happen next, I think, is going to be quite unfortunate for the American people. Because what we're about to see this committee do is vote on several nominees who are so extreme, who are so unqualified, that they could not have a prayer of getting even a single Republican vote on this committee. And as everyone knows, Senator Graham votes for most of Biden's nominees. It is unusual that Senator Graham does not give a Republican vote to a Biden nominee. But there's a small subset of these nominees that are so beyond the pale that they have no prayer of getting a Republican nominee. And frankly, if my Democrat colleagues valued the responsibility of the Senate's advise and consent, my Democrat colleagues would tell the White House these nominees are unacceptable. This first nominee, Charnel Beckelgren, is so amazingly unqualified, she may well have the title for the least qualified nominee I've seen in 11 years serving on this committee. When Senator Kennedy asked her what Article 5 of the Constitution was, she had no idea. When Senator Kennedy asked her what Article 2 of the Constitution was, she said, I don't know. Mind you, Article 2 is the provision of the Constitution that creates the president and the executive branch of the government. Any first-year law student that didn't know what Article 2 of the Constitution was would flunk con law. This is not some obscure question about some Latin phrase no one should know. This is literally the basic architecture of our Constitution. By the way, Joe Biden has nominated her to be an Article 3 judge. Article 3 is right after Article 2. It creates the federal judiciary. I assume she doesn't know what that is either. I would note that the chairman, in defending her, suggested, well, gosh, there may be some members of our committee that don't know what Article 2 is. I feel confident that's not true, but if there is on either side of the aisle, you should stand up and resign the committee right now. To give you a sense of how unqualified this nominee is, she listed in her judiciary questionnaire her top 10 litigated cases. And I just want you to pause and read this for a second. Her top 10, she did a driver's license revocation. She did a second driver's license revocation. She did an unemployment benefits appeal. She did another unemployment benefits case. She did another unemployment benefit case. And her sixth case was an unemployment benefits case where on the opposing side was a pro se litigant. In other words, this poor fella didn't have a lawyer. And you know what? The pro se litigant beat her. She lost to a pro se litigant. What's her seventh most consequential case? I'm sorry, there isn't one. There's not an eighth, there's not a ninth, there's not a 10th. She's argued over a couple of driver's licenses, and the Biden White House says you should be a federal judge, an Article 3 judge, not that you have any idea what in the hell that is. In this administration, if you are a left-wing radical, it doesn't matter if you're competent. In Washington state, is there not a single competent lawyer who is competent to be a judge? And by the way, for all the Democrats, since Joe Biden has become president, every one of you has rubber-stamped every single nominee. Is there not a one of you that is willing to say enough is enough? When Donald Trump was president on the Republican side, we confirmed some fantastic judges, but there were several we sent back that we said, no, you missed it on this one. There's not even one Democrat willing to say enough is enough. And by the way, she's not the only one. Another one being considered, a nominee, Cruz. Thankfully not spelled C-R-U-Z, spelled C-R-E-W-S. When asked about Brady versus Maryland, one of the foundational criminal law classes, again, first-year criminal law, you learn about Brady. She said, I'm sorry, I don't know what Brady is. That'll be a problem if she's ever presiding over a criminal case. There are a number of members of this committee who have tried criminal cases. Do you know what Brady is? Of course you do. Because if you're remotely competent, you know what it is, not this judge. Look, sadly, the standard for nominees now seems to be licensed attorneys in Washington. Have you ever handled a criminal case? You ever tried a jury trial? Have you ever stepped foot in federal court? Well, then please contact Senate Democrats, because you too can be a federal judge. I want to end with one more nominee that we're getting ready to ram through on party line votes. That is Judge Marian Gaston, nominated for a seat in San Diego. Judge Gaston, look, we've seen some radicals. We had a nominee earlier that this committee rubber stamped who said he woke up every morning motivated by his hatred for conservatives. Senate Democrats said, sounds like a judge to me. But let's see just how moonbat crazy we're willing to put on the bench. Here's a quote from Judge Gaston. Children are not safer because registered sex offenders are prohibited from residing near schools, parks, daycare centers, and other places where children tend to gather. And in fact, Judge Gaston continued, let's go to the next one. Judge Gaston continued, the conclusions and recommendations are that, difficult as it might be, so at least Judge Gaston recognizes this is pretty wingnut, the conclusion, laws that regulate where sex offenders may not live should be repealed or substantially modified in the interest of public safety. So I want you to understand the Joe Biden White House is saying a radical who wants sex offenders, who wants pedophiles to be able to live next door to daycares. That's who should be a federal judge. Look, some of y'all here represent blue states. Many of y'all represent blue states. I guarantee you in any one of your states. You go to Vermont, ask the people of Vermont, hey, what do you think about having a pedophile live next door to an elementary school, to a kindergarten, to a daycare? They'd look at you and say, are you out of your mind? That's who the Biden White House has given you. Now, I genuinely don't understand why Senate Democrats on this committee don't have enough respect for the constitutional role of the Senate to exercise some check and balance on the White House. I don't think they'll make you hand in your card-carrying Democrat cards to say, gosh darn it, we ought to have a judge who knows what the heck he's doing. John Kennedy has left bloody carcasses in this hearing from Trump nominees who didn't have sufficient experience to do the job. I ask my colleagues, if you vote for these nominees, you're going to have to defend them to your constituents. You're going to have to explain why a lawyer who handled a couple of driver's license revocations and doesn't know what Article 2 of the Constitution is should be a federal judge in charge of your life, your rights, and the law. And you're going to have to explain why you think it's a great idea that sex offenders and pedophiles should live next door to daycare centers. I think that's nuts. And I think most of our constituents do too.
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Lee.
Conservative groups as, quote, hate groups. And the SPLC's history is so egregious that it prompted a violent hate crime. In 2010, the SPLC designated the Family Research Council as a hate group, and 2 years later, a man targeted the Family Research Council using the SPLC's hate map and came in and shot and critically wounded the council's business manager and attempted to murder several council members before being heroically stopped by the building's security guard. The SPLC in 2019 authored an article that accused Republicans, including 3 members of this committee, of holding, quote, open white supremacist views. Mr. Chairman, that's ridiculous. You know that's ridiculous. Political rhetoric is one thing, but when you have extreme leftists falsely claiming white supremacy, it illustrates that you are dealing with radicals and partisan zealots. Nancy Obodo isn't the only nominee that this committee is trying to move forward. This committee also has before it Nusrat Chowdhury, who is another extreme zealot. Ms. Chowdhury believes that America is through and through an evil and racist place. And she's not been shy about explaining that. She has stated that, quote, the structure of racial discrimination in America, quote, is so deep, so pernicious, that you have to, quote, use the law as a tool of social justice. Does anyone think she's going to stop, quote, using the law as a tool of social justice if she ascends to the bench? The most concerning thing Ms. Chowdhury said is she participated in a panel at my alma mater, Princeton University. The panel was entitled How Activism Informs Policy. And one of the panelists there suggested that police officers kill unarmed black men every day. Now, there's a technical term for that statement. That's called a lie. It's not even kind of sort of right. It is wildly, totally false. During her nomination hearing, she was asked about a tweet that came from that event, which said that she had agreed with the statement that police officers kill unarmed black men every single day. At first, she claimed she couldn't remember making the statement. Then later in the same hearing, she claimed she did make the statement, but she did so, quote, as an advocate. She said so 3 separate times. Well, I just, did it as an advocate. Now, most of the members of this committee have practiced law. The last I checked, as an advocate, you have an obligation not to lie. And that is a brazen lie that is dangerous. Now, subsequently, she sent a follow-up letter after her hearing saying, oh, never mind, I didn't say it. The thing that she had justified as, oh, I said it as an advocate. Afterwards, she sent a letter and said, no, actually, I didn't say it. Republicans on this committee asked for a follow-up hearing to ask about her miraculous new memory post-hearing that she didn't say such a harmful thing to police officers across the country. Sadly, the chairman wouldn't give us a new hearing. Another of the judges being considered today, Kenley Kia Cato. At her hearing, I asked her a very simple question. Is racial discrimination wrong? She was utterly unable to answer it. Today's Democrat Party embraces racial discrimination, believes that discriminating based on race, the reason, Mr. Chairman, and you are smirking, but the reason she couldn't answer it is because in law school, she had written an article advocating racial discrimination against Asian Americans. Now, Ms. Cato is Asian American. And she said, and I'm paraphrasing here, I don't have the article in front of me, but she essentially said that Asian Americans who didn't support explicit racial discrimination against Asian Americans weren't sufficiently woke. They weren't sufficiently enlightened. Now, I think that's a noxious position. But that's, of course, why she couldn't answer that racial discrimination was wrong, because she is an advocate for racial discrimination. Another one of the nominees being considered this morning is Dale Ho. Dale Ho is a self-described, quote, wild-eyed sort of leftist. Now, let me be clear. That's not my terminology. That's how he describes himself. He says, I am a, quote, wild-eyed sort of leftist. He wrote about how he's motivated each day by his hate for conservatives. That's the word he used, hate. Now, I want you to pause for a second and imagine. I'm going to ask the Democrat members of this committee to do something, which is imagine you're in somebody else's shoes. Engage in empathy. There are actually conservatives in the state of New York. Now, the Democrat governor of New York said to Republicans in New York, "You're not New Yorkers. Get the hell out. Go to Florida where you belong." There's an arrogance to telling your voters that. But it's one thing when you're an elected official if you want to demonstrate that kind of arrogance, but one would think that a federal judge has a different obligation. So I would ask the members of this committee, imagine for a second you were a Republican. Imagine for a second you were a conservative who happened to live in New York City. And you look up in New York City on the federal bench and you see a judge who's described himself as a wild-eyed sort of leftist, his own words, who is motivated every day, who gets up every day, and what gets him going is his hatred for you. You know, this is the kind of fellow that should have worked at the Southern Poverty Law Center. That's the kind of radicals who this administration is nominating, and yet that is not the kind of person that should be a federal judge. And I'm going to talk about one final nominee that isn't before us today, but that will be soon, which is Charnel Beckelgren. Now, the members of this committee are aware of just how wildly unqualified this nominee was. She's been nominated to be a federal district judge, and our colleague, Senator Kennedy, whose cross-examinations on this committee have now become legendary, he asked her what Article 5 of the Constitution was. And she responded saying, well, she couldn't remember, she wasn't familiar with that. He then asked her what Article 2 of the Constitution was. And she said, well, that's not coming to mind either. It was a stunning display of her lack of qualifications to be a federal judge. Now, to be clear, asking someone what Article 2 of the Constitution is not some obscure legal gotcha. There are questions you can ask about bizarre, hidden legal theories that would be a gotcha, that wouldn't be fair. Not knowing what Article 2 of the Constitution is, which is what establishes the president and the executive branch, any first-year law student who didn't know what Article 2 of the Constitution was would flunk con law. And I will say Chairman Durbin subsequently said publicly she was likely to get confirmed. And he went on to say that he thought there were members of this committee who couldn't answer the question Senator Kennedy asked as well. I hope and pray that's not the case. I'm confident that on the Republican side of the aisle, the members of this committee know what Article 2 is. Are there any members of this committee who care to volunteer on the Democrat side of the aisle that you don't know what Article 2 is? If you didn't, you or I or anyone who didn't know what Article 2 was would not be qualified to serve on this committee. And I will say, I want to encourage the Democrats on the committee to follow Chairman Durbin's lead. Chairman Durbin, during the Trump administration, explained on a nominee, he said he invoked what he called the Senator John Kennedy test. And Chairman Durbin said, quote, I think it's a legitimate test to be applied to all those who want to be trial judges, and I hope others on both sides of the table will join me in saying it's not enough to aspire. You have to bring to this aspiration some practical experience and knowledge that suggests you can meet the standard required. And I just want to close by this, which is urging my colleagues to be willing to stand up to the White House. I'm confident that many, if not most of you, actually care about having a qualified judiciary. One of the things I cannot understand over the last 2 years is every Democrat member of this committee has voted for every single Biden judicial nominee 100% without failing. And I will say on the Senate floor, every Democrat has voted for every Biden judicial nominee. Not a single Democrat in the United States Senate has mustered the courage to vote no on a single nominee. And to be clear, it wasn't that long ago. We had a Republican president and a Republican majority in this body, and there were many of us who said on particular nominees, this is not a good nominee. We're not going to support this nominee. In fact, the John Kennedy test that Chairman Durbin referred to came from a Trump nominee who John Kennedy eviscerated at a hearing in a video that I still liken to watching a car wreck in slow motion. It was painful. But what happened? When it became clear that this individual was not qualified for the position for which he had been nominated, the White House withdrew the nomination. And it did so after a number of us made clear we're not going to support putting an unqualified person on the bench, pull the nomination back. So I would ask members of this committee, is there anyone, if the White House nominates a ham sandwich, are Democrats prepared to rubber stamp Judge Ham Sandwich? And this also connects to the discussion on the blue slip. Look, I understand politics. Sometimes we put on team colors and you're a Democrat or Republican and you vote with your party, and that, for a number of issues, is fine. But do any Democrat members of this committee actually care about defending the institution of the Senate and your authority as a senator to represent your state? Because the blue slip, fundamentally, it's not even a partisan issue. It is fundamentally about Article 1 versus Article 2. Now, Biden's judicial nominees have no idea what I just said. But the blue slip is all about, are judges going to be picked solely by the president or by the home state senators? And let's be clear, this is not just when the opposing party is in the White House. When Donald Trump was president, there were some, I think, 22 judicial vacancies on the district court in Texas. When Trump was president.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Milgram, would you agree that the vast majority of the heroin, the methamphetamine, and fentanyl we see in American communities comes from Mexico?